Thank you, Sirak. Very many important findings to discuss, and what better way to do it than to invite our eminent panel up on stage. We have with us Helge Lunde, who is the Executive Director of ICORN, International Cities of Refuge Network. Come up. Katya García-Antón, Director and Chief Curator of the Office for Contemporary Art Norway. Pia Maria Roll and Hanan Benammar, who are artists behind the play Ways of Seeing. And we also have with us Peder Egenæs, who just ran out to lobby the State Secretary for 2 minutes. But he will join us very shortly. Helge Lunde, to start things off.
You have to use the mic, is that right?
Yes, we do have to use the mic, although everyone knows you're not stupid. I've already told them. To start things off, what do you make of the report's findings?
It is impressive in many ways when you see it at the catalog, but it's also, of course, very depressing. Sorry, no, of course I need to speak. Also, as if the microphone is not working, as it not is. It is also, of course, a very worrying and a very depressing report because it says something about the world of today that is not going the way that we wish it to go. But then also, of course, it says that it's important to work, and as Sirak just said in the end, the works of prevention need to, and changing the structure has to go hand in hand with the concrete help and assistance for the actors, for the artists out there. And I think that is a very important point, and that is somehow also where ICORN, the International Cities of Refuge Network, and our work comes in. But in all, it's very important, the report, and we are very glad to have Freemuse as a very good cooperation partner in the work that we also perform.
And what ICORN does is you offer shelter to writers and artists that are at risk as a direct consequence of what they do. Do you see the report's findings mirrored in your own work? Is there an increase of your work, for example? Or?
Yes, definitely. When we started 10 or 12 years ago, there were maybe 50, 60, 70 persecuted writers and artists applying to get sheltered by our system. In 2017, we had 119 applications for persecuted writers and artists, and in 2018, it rose from 119 to 159. So there's a huge increase, and we are now daily in contact with between 300 and 400 persecuted writers and artists all over the world, most of them in the troubled fields where they are working, but all over the place. And we really see that, we get concrete evidence every day that the space for human rights, for freedom of expression is shrinking.
Katya García-Antón, reading the report and hearing the remarks made here today, what stand out to you as important points from your perspective and work?
Well, thank you very much. I think I echo the sentiments of my colleague, and I'm sure I echo all of your sentiments when thinking that this report brings serious attention and great warning to us all. I'd like to make 2 points, and perhaps we'll have time later on to elaborate on my second point. The first point is a question, really, perhaps a clarification. I was surprised to see the word minorities, the minorities section, as encompassing also indigenous communities, especially as we are aware that the United Nations has very clearly said that indigenous communities are not a minority, but they should be addressed as indigenous communities. So that's the first thing that I was wondering, and also wondering what are the methodologies upon which one looks at the situation of artists in indigenous communities, particularly since very often these are cross-nation situations. So that's my first reaction. My second reaction would be to applaud some of the points in this report, particularly point 5, point 10, and point 14. as these are points that really recommend the government's role in encouraging a plural and diverse political environment that strengthens the mandates of relevant institutions. And I feel this is something I want to bring the debate back home. I think this is something we really need to look at quite seriously here in Norway. There's too much complacency. I'm standing from the position of the arts field, the visual arts. I feel there's so much more that needs to be done, and it's urgent, in particular with regards to our diasporic communities. Let us remember that Oslo has almost a third of its community, which is diasporic, and also with regards to the indigenous communities that live across the Nordic region, but also in Norway. And I'd just like to highlight point 10 and point 14, since they are kind of interconnected. Point 10 being about the government's providing a positive discriminatory method. And this means with regards to financials, to enabling access to the broad cultural life, and to including arts education and professional development. And I'd like to link those points to these diasporic communities and to the indigenous communities. And point 14 being about how the government and how all of us actually, with positions to be able to enable all of this, will create programs to increase dialogue in broader society across gender, ethnic, religious, and cultural diversities. And let us just remember that we are in Oslo, and Oslo does not have a single street name that pays homage to its indigenous communities, nor is a single monument or place in public space that addresses its colonial history or its current relationships.
We will definitely come back to how we can change that as you wish for. But Jon Peder, I mean, your day job is human rights across the world. To kind of open it up a bit, how does artistic freedom kind of stand in the larger scheme of things of human rights situation in the world?
Sorry. First of all, I must apologize for coming late, but if there's a politician in the room, I have to lobby. I'm sorry. And what's important was about Saudi Arabia. Well, I mean, it's, as I said in my remarks, what we see in today's report is just a kind of I don't know if it's micro, but it's a microcosm of what we see in general. There is a definite development towards limiting freedom of expression, and is going across the world. And of course, and I think that there are some, and this might be different from country to country, but you often see that artists are some of the first they pick up. Journalists and artists, people who express themselves in ways that many people relate to and interact with, are of course dangerous for those in power or those who want to keep some sort of, you know, hegemony or whatever. So this report just underlines what we and other organizations say about the general development in the world. And Fritt said something that unfortunately I think is becoming something that all human rights activists and organizations are realizing, a realization of all of us, is that our main job right now is to try to stop the development or slow down even the development in the wrong direction, rather than what we thought in the 90s, where we thought we were just going to expand and expand and expand. Literally now we are sort of standing, holding our arms against a negative development, saying, you know, you need to stop this. One of the, and I'll stop now. One of the things that, and this is more a realization of my own, is not necessarily the Amnesty International view. I have to say that. But that is, I think my thinking is that we are seeing a situation where the intergovernmental international organizations and conventions and etc. are losing power. So less and less leaders of states are saying, I am guided by human rights conventions or whatever, and more is happening at the national level. So when we're talking about solutions, one of the positive things, I've been working with this longer than a lot of you have lived. No, it's not such a young audience this time, well, for a long time. One of the positive things we have seen in the last 30 years is that there are human rights activists and organizations in almost every single country of the world. When I started in the early 90s, that was not the case. So I think the way of working with the fact that a lot will have to happen on a national level is to build more international networks of artists, of human rights activists, of everybody well-intentioned to try to stop this development.
We will come back to many of those points as well. I'll just bring in the rest of you. Pia, Maria, Rol. We will shortly talk about your own very recent experience that has been mentioned in many of the remarks introducing this panel today. But firstly, in general, how do you experience being an artist in Norway and the freedoms you're allowed until your very recent experience?
I mean, we're artists, so of course we're very much interested in culture, actually. And I hope we get to talk about culture, like when ideas and forms of repressions are internalized. And I mean, Norway is one of the countries in the world, I would presume, with the highest degree of freedom of speech, and maybe one of the countries with also the highest degree of conformity, which is a paradox, and of course. And for an artist who is always, I mean, we are looking at the political overall tendencies, powers, structures, but we're also looking into the existential questions, of course. And I hope we also get there today, because I feel that a lot of discussions about freedom of speech is and should be about legal issues, the possibility of funding, of course, platforms. It is extremely important to talk about that. But of course, when you look at the report, which is extremely interesting, you see that the tendency of freedom of repression, actually, internal repression also, that's incorrect. I mean, the problem with freedom of speech is also increasing in the global north, as you say. And the problem we have in Scandinavia, for example, is, of course, how we look upon the role of the artist, the role of the journalist. How do we see, how do we understand this role in society? Not in art, not in a closed environment of art, but in our society. And just to finish off, I'm just saying one more thing. I'm also a jury member in the Ibsen in an Ibsen Prize that is international. So I read like 100 approximately applications for making theater performance from all over the world, really, like literally all over the world, which is of course very interesting. And what struck me in the first round now 2 years ago is that is just this: how do we perceive our role as theater makers and artists? And the applications that comes from the West, like Europe, not south of Europe, not Spain and Greece, but from north of Europe, USA, Canada, we look upon ourselves, you know, it's the postmodern, a little bit political, a little bit like into form and experiment with form. In all of Africa and South America, Asia, the overall view on the artist is that you live in conflict. And the artist is always, my MPD is just this. So, but just to mention it, is that it's very much about criticizing power, understanding a man under struggle, and of course taking risk. And we can come back to this also with the process of ways of seeing, because I think we have to understand that the immigrant population, like the idea of multiculturality, to understand like these issues from different parts of the world is, if we're going to talk about solutions, I think it's somewhere here is one of the possible solutions.
And to take it one step further with you, Hanan, I mean, in case someone here hasn't really followed the case around ways of seeing, which has been very difficult if you live in Norway, because it's everywhere as it should be. I mean, the police ended up charging the two of you and two other persons for the play that you were putting up at Black Box. How did it, like, what does it do to you as an artist when that happens?
I mean, I think for anyone, not only as... I mean, I tend to... I mean, I understand the concept of trying to relate as an artist, but I usually relate just as a citizen. And I also think that for having a little bit followed like all this sort of anti-racist activism in Norway, I mean, I would say that most anti-racist activists live like that. I mean, so I mean that's like normal. It's normal for lots of my friends in this milieu to be harassed continuously by platforms such as Reset and Human Rights Service and things like that, and sometimes by politicians as well. So as an artist, of course, I realized how much, in a way, we were protected from these discussions, even though I thought before that we were very good at discussing this, or political issues and diversity, and so it kind of flipped my understanding of how much work had to be was still to be done in a way within the artistic milieu and in relation to society, or so yeah.
So, I mean, and speaking of this, Katya, you touched upon the artistic community and what the artistic community can do. This is a very recent example, of course, in Norway. And what can an art institution like your own do to help artistic freedom also in a country like Norway, or hinder for that matter?
Well, I think for me the answer is not about one institution, but it's about a whole cultural awareness in our sector. And the point I wanted to make was about the infrastructural complacency which we seem to be inhabiting in Norway today. It's not enough to say to an artist, you are free to do what you like, and you won't be put into a prison, if that artist then is not given the resources and the infrastructure in order to be able to bring their perspectives into the wider society. And that is not happening if you do not have artists from that community. Let us think diasporically, let us think about the Sami community, at the very heart of those institutions, setting the agenda curatorially, setting the agenda in terms of conservation of objects, in terms of mediation to the publics, in all sorts of powerful positions in that infrastructure. So what I would advocate for is that we look again at the infrastructure that we have in Norway, since freedom of speech is just not going to happen unless that infrastructure is changed. I think about it in terms of the 3 Ps. We have to think about programming, publics, and personnel. All of that needs to be addressing and connected to the freedom of speech that we're looking at. And if you don't have that, well, you will get apathy, social apathy. Let us look at the media. Unfortunately, the positions for critics for cultures is just reducing constantly. But not only that, those that are left are certainly not in the majority, not those that maybe have indigenous perspectives or indigenous trainings or from diasporic communities. And let us think about education of the arts, or wider, broader education. Those perspectives are not coming in either, which means that it's less likely that you're going to get artistic figures emerging from that situation. So it's a broader, interconnected, intersectional approach that we need to look at harshly in our community.
And Jon Peder, you highlighted that, I mean, these kind of initiatives that Katya is proposing now are of course very important, but you were highlighting that right now it feels like we're just kind of trying to stand up against the wall instead of actually improving. Can you do both at the same time?
I'm sure. I must admit that sort of what she's talking about is way beyond my scope of knowledge. So I couldn't sort of go into that kind of detail, and I'm working at a much more sort of overall putting people in prison level. But of course, in countries like Norway, where, you know, yes, we have instances like Ways of Seeing where we just have to be vigilant and have to attack our government and be very, very clear. But in general, we have more challenges, like I mentioned here, than the sort of really harsh sort of penal code challenges. And I'll just give you an example related to this. 2019, I believe, is the UN year for indigenous languages. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the most translated document in the world, more than the Bible, and we don't have a Sami version. There is no Sami version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and several institutions in Norway have found it too expensive to translate. So it just shows you that this goes, you know, it's at a higher level than the details you are talking about. Yeah, but yes, of course, one can fight the big international trends and at the same time realize that in some countries we don't necessarily have to push back at that level, but work to make sure that the freedom of artistic expression is true for everybody. Because that might be one of the problems we're talking about here, that yes, if you are a middle-aged white man and I suddenly wanted to paint or write or whatever, I would probably be so shit that nobody would do it. But I mean, you know, I would have, my position would give me a very, very different access than other people of different minority, whether it's a indigenous minority or a diaspora minority would have. And that is, of course, something we should discuss. Is the conversation, and that, to me, goes across the board, is the conversation in Norway diverse enough, or am I too often on panels like this?
We promised to talk about solutions in this panel, since many of the problems have been presented already. But Helge, Lunde, how do we navigate this this space and all these problems? Do you have any suggestions of how we can approach this?
Yes, I think one of the things we need to do is to contemplate and look beyond the borders and the walls where we normally segregate ourselves or works. I'll try to come to a point in a second. What we definitely want to commend Freemuse and also SafeMuse for pressuring ICORN to take not upon only journalists, writers, bloggers, singer-songwriters, cartoonists, but from 2014, ICORN cities also started to invite persecuted non-verbal artists. So we managed, ICORN has developed in that direction, so that the cities, 75 soon cities around the world, can also work to protect and promote persecuted artists. And one of the things that have, I think, come out of that this new ways of cooperation is that, I mean, we are globally working a lot with the EU. You can imagine the EU has a huge regime, a huge instrument working to protect and promote human rights defenders. And when we started to work with the EU, we managed to let the EU, this mechanism, regard persecuted writers and artists also as eligible human rights defenders for protection, for support, for funding, anything. Not every writer is a human rights defender. Not every artist is a human rights defender. Not every human rights defender is a writer or an artist. But there's a huge potential in bringing these different sectors together. And one of the things that we have been doing at the EU temporary relocation platform, that's, by the way, is working very well, is to let them, that they have also found out, they used to work mainly with human rights defenders all over the world, but they have looked into the field and they have also now seen artists as eligible for support, for protection, promotion within this sphere. I think this is quite to look beyond the fences and to cooperate over the borders is important. And I don't say that we have to politicize arts, that's definitely not what I mean, but for artists in the field, especially that is where we work mainly. Our goal is not to get the people out like we do when it's needed in the cities of refuge, but working in the field together to prevent situations, to prevent persecution and imprisonment and even murder to happen. Out in the field where we work together, we should also contemplate that artists many times, even though they don't know it or they don't regard themselves as a human rights defender, they really are.
Pia, you mentioned that you wanted to discuss the internal censorship as well that you think that many artists are feeling in your introduction. What do you want to?
No, because it's. I suppose the reason that we are invited. Thank you very much for that. Is because in the end we were persecuted, like legally. But that has happened for a long time, and it was when it was taken out siktelse, which I don't know, a charge, that people woke up and started to defend us. But we had been under this pressure for 4 months, and nobody was there. I mean, really, none of the art organization. I mean, a lot of people was there. I'm sorry, but none of the people in power were there, like the organization. The funders, the press, Fritt Ord. I mean, almost wrote the article after Erna Solberg came out and attacked us. But and I think I need like 2 minutes to explain, because it was a narrative created by the extreme right in Norway about what we did, which was based on false premises, on propaganda actually. It was very well conducted, and we were actually accused of instigating murder attempt on the country's prime minister. I'm sorry, Justice Minister. And a lot of these attacks appeared, and one of them, which was, very clear, was Christian Tybring-Gjedde, who's in the Defense Committee on Stortinget in Norway, posting on his Facebook post a direct attack on Sarah Baban, who's sitting in the audience, one of the actors, who's from Iraqi Kurdistan. And in the performance are talking about what is happening in Kurdish Syria now, and the relationship to Turkey and all these things. And he attacked her on his Facebook page violently, with her name, and saying things like, and this is a man who's in the Norwegian Parliament, saying this is the thanks for letting refugees in. She fled from Saddam Hussein when she was 10 years old, and nobody said anything about that. No, and why is that? And for us, we are very lucky. We are sitting here under these nice lamps, and with you, profiled, very respected people, talking to you, very respected people. But if this wife of the Justice Minister hadn't been caught, where would we be then? We would be fine, because we have our, as we say, the anti-racist, the Kurdish people in Norway, always, standing up for us all along. We have our, we would be fine. Also because so a lot of us are quite established artists. We have our theater. We have a support system around us. But what happens next time? This is the absolute most important thing to discuss, because if she hadn't been caught and we had been like younger artists, more vulnerable, what would that say to the artistic community, to the journalists, about how you are protected if you take risk in criticizing the government through art?
We will soon open up for questions from the audience, so please think about them. But first, some comments from the...
Yeah, I just want to sort of do some general comments on this, and I'm not going to... I'm sure we were way too late in reacting to this, so that's not my point. We can listen to that, how we should monitor these kinds of things. But I think this is a general... and it's also actually in the report of Freemuse, is that it's no longer, that's nowhere in the world, only the governments or the organized powers that be. It's actually the websites, the social media, the mob, so to speak, that also play a very, very important role in silencing people. And I think that is more than just in this example where I'm sure several people have, or organizations and institutions should have reacted in a different way. It just shows that we need, and I think here political leaders, and this is where rights collide, need to look at, both the providers of these social platforms, our authorities, and we ourselves need to look at sort of what's going on in that sphere, because it is becoming not only sort of individually, psychologically a problem, but it is becoming violent. And we know that people react violently to the calls that are being made in the cyberspace. So this is a problem that we just need to look very, very carefully at. And it's not only artists, but artists, because they are living, they live through their expressions, will always be very targeted for this.
And when you say rights collide,
because some people say, okay, so what? So how do we what's it called? Begrense. Limit the expressions of Helge Lurås and Storhaug, etc., in a way that they can't say, oh, you're violating my freedom of expression, my human rights. There is a balance to be struck here. I think I have some ideas on how you could do that, but still, you know, there will always be this debate that is very similar to the debate we have here. Oh, so Amnesty is now going to decide whether Helge Lurås can say A, B, and C.
For the non-Norwegian audience, he's a writer.
Yeah, website, Reset. He's not here, so I shouldn't use his name, sorry.
Yeah, he can't say anything to it. Helge, did you have a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to say small something. Because I've heard many times when the piece is being introduced that it's a provocative art piece. I don't think so. I mean, anyone that is aware of art history knows that it's not a provocative art piece. It's a critical art piece. And I think it's very different. What is provocative for me has been the reaction of the politicians seeing actually lies being shamelessly put in the public space without any possibility for us to defend ourselves, like properly. And I think it did trigger an uncomfortable feeling, I think, of being maybe kind of like this. I think what Pia was talking about, this internalized racism, actually, that is really embedded in lots of cultures, and yes, of course, Norway as well. So that was maybe the provocative aspect for people, to actually realize how much prejudices have been anchored in all the discussions we have been witnessing the last years or so. And I also would like to add that for us, the piece was not about making a provocation or, you know, it was about trying to understand the place where we are and give meaning to it in a way. And I've read very recently in The Guardian that poetry sales in the UK have risen like 30% the last 2 years. Probably because that's their hypothesis, because there is a lack of meaningful language in the public space, especially by politicians. And I think we are currently in this crisis of a loss of meaningful language and discussions.
Which is also a very important debate. But Katya, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I just wanted to reinforce once again that really the devil is in the detail. And what I mean by this, you mentioned about details. I think details are important. Given that the report shows us that the forces that are silencing artists are broader than ever, what we're really talking about is a debate in society. Unless society is more open and more critical, we're not going to be able to avoid the situations that you have unfortunately been in. And how do we make that society broader? Well, I think the institutions and the governments related to those institutions have the responsibility to positively reinforce, to create positive discrimination in those institutions, to be able to bring this broader, more plural, more diverse approach embedded, because the institutions are the ones that are really mediating with society. Unless we want to change, those perspectives, unless we want to bring them strongly, we will never be able to deal with this current situation.
Are there any questions from the audience? Would like to? Yes. Do we have a mic? Yeah, it's coming right behind you.
Yeah, hi. Okay, it's not really a question. It's more like an encouragement. My name is Mette Tronvold. I'm an artist, and I've been following the debate in Norway.
Is it okay to stand up? It's just
okay.
a bit easier to hear.
With everybody, or with many others, and it's been very upsetting and interesting. And maybe the most disturbing aspect for me has been to see how many opinions there are without actually having seen the theater piece, including myself, because I haven't had the opportunity to do it. That's been how many opinions there are possible to make without actually having seen what you're talking about. And in that sense, I think that NRK or national TV, I want to encourage, I don't know if this is the right audience or the platform to say that, but in fact, we should see it on TV so that people have the possibility to actually see what we're talking about and keep to the, yeah. This is like just a little input on the debate, basically. That I miss facts and that we can make our own opinion about your piece. Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone from NRK is here, bring it with you, or we could take it to them. There's another question here. Yes? There's a mic. It's just for the recording.
I'm also in the piece, just so. I'm Christian Tybring-Gjedde's favorite, probably. But for me to want to show it on TV, or that's not, then for me it would be wrong. I just want to say that, because then we have to show people, then they would say, okay, is it right or wrong what they are doing? That's not why we made this piece. It's because, as Hanan says, we want to find out our society, who we are in our society. Where is our place in this society? And for me, it would be, it's not, we are going to show the piece again. So those who want to come can come and see, because it's more than just seeing it on TV. Yes.
It's everyone's noted that. There are some more questions. Were there? Yeah, right next to you.
Thank you. Jan Lote Eriksen. I'm a project manager of Freemuse. It's interesting what you're saying, because where were the art organizations? Where were people when it all started out? It's actually the same that Dia Khan said when she left Norway as a 17-year-old artist. She had to leave Norway. Nobody reacted. And I wonder, why is this? At the time Dia left Norway, I was vice president of the Musicians Union. I have apologized her for that later, because what I think is that, especially these last years, after 2011, we have had a change. So that's not an excuse for what happened to Dia. But we have had a change in the language and the way we have the communication out in the open. We are used to harsh language. And when things like this happens, I mean, Tybring-Gjedde saying this, he's saying this all the time. So probably we should be more aware. But I think also our politicians and our media should be much more aware. Politicians, for what kind of language they are using in the debate, because some of them are firing up this way of keeping the conversation going. And media should be much more on the alert and also much more critical to start a debate around some theoretic or fantasy idea about what this play was like. So I think there are several things behind, and we have to be more open and more listening and not so hush in our way of communication.
There is no representatives of the politicians or media in the panel today, but do anyone of you want to add anything to that point?
I just say that I obviously agree. Our debate has gone way out of bounds. My Danish colleague once says, you can now say things in the parliament that you would be thrown out of an after party if you said it 10 years ago. So, but I think I'm not saying we have to accept it, but it is a fact, and we need to find ways of interjecting different kinds of languages, not sort of silencing it in a sort of way of censorship, but we just need to have decent people in the debate, and we need to have more people in the debate with different voices, because I don't think you will persuade some politicians and semi-politicians, if you wish, to change their rhetoric, and they're not at the level where you'll arrest them for it. So, you know, but I think we need to try to outspeak them.
I just wanted to add that I think after the Breivik attack, I mean, I've actually been in Norway all this time, and I arrived just before that, and I don't know if I became more aware of certain form of racism that were in the public space, but I think there has been certainly an increase of language that we would not think would be possible to use before. But I also think it's linked to the fact that Islamophobia is not a form of racism that is counted as racism. And it's very normal to have Islamophobic views in the public space without having this reality check in a way. And it's been because also, I mean, what Islamophobia is also that it targets people that are also have nothing to do with Islam, like me or Sarah. I mean, but it's just this sort of prejudice of certain names, of certain Arab-looking maybe culture, a huge ignorance on what the Middle East is, on what Arab cultures are, of what Islams are. I mean, it's like this idea that there is the West, very homogeneous bloc, as we know. I mean, hello, also. The idea that of Western culture, it's, you know, it's just, it makes me laugh every day. And the idea of another, you know, Arab culture, just this whole thing, and this is being carried on over and over again by art history, by institutions, by the press, so there is so much, you know. I think, and so that's totally, and I think for the government that we have, I mean, when you said we need more decent people in the discussion, we also need a more decent government as a basis. Because if you have, I mean, how can we, I mean, I'm not interested in discussing with people like Siv Jensen or to bring it up, you know? Like, we need more decent people also.
Okay.
And I think, just to finish, I think art is the kind of one of the highest exercise of democracy. And it's obviously a danger for dangerous people.
Again, the government is not here today. Yes, Knut Olav, you have a question?
Thanks to Pia and the others from the theater company for being here. And thanks for critical questions too. It's very important for many of us, both in arts organizations and in the freedom of expression field, to understand what happened during those 4 months, especially when most of the case was below the radar, below people's conscious attention, so to speak. And I have some reflections. Firstly, something happened in Norwegian public space after 2011. Many of us reading Facebook forums have every day since the terror attacks in 2011 been reading threats and harassment toward leading Labour Party and Labour Party youth politicians. and so forth. And something happened also after 2015, I think, after the refugee crisis in Europe, and combined that year with the terror attacks in Paris twice, towards Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan, and also the terror attacks in Copenhagen towards the synagogue and the freedom of expression discussion meeting. Something happened in the public sphere in several countries, and also in Norway after that year too. And the more or less unedited public spaces, the so-called alternative media, are no longer marginal. They are very big. They have hundreds of thousands of readers every day. Such medias as Reset, Rights.no, and Document.no. They are different, but often it's very disturbing, to put it mildly, to read these comments from the public in special. But what happened during those 4 months when the theater play was reported to the police, but nothing much happened? You were not called in to explain yourself. The police seemed to do almost nothing. What one could notice in the public space was the several attacks towards the private property of the justice minister. And I think, and after one of the last ones of that kind, several members of the government said that this is threats against democracy. It's a threat against our civilization and towards freedom of expression. The attacks towards the justice minister's car and house and property. And then, as we know, a few weeks ago came the charges against the justice minister's wife. But I think during those 4 months, many organizations should have reacted. But I think the right-wing populism and others succeeded in making people worried about the possible link between an art of work, between words and art on stage, and violence and actions. And this is a tendency in our time. Many have written things about it. This misobserved, constructed link between words and actions, trying to make words and utterances and art more similar to actions. And it has also been a problem that almost no one has seen the play, of course, and just saying more or less false things about it, and also confusing the seconds of filming of house facades from public spaces, confusing this with the fiction taking place on stage. And it's only until the recent weeks that these facts have occurred to me too, and that's a shame. So lack of facts and too irresponsible journalism and public debate also involving politicians. So there is so much to learn. Thank you to the theater group and Pia for just persevering and for coming here too.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Does anyone have any very last short words to say in the panel as a comment?
I would just like to say, since we're here because of Freemuse, this is, and it's incredibly important, this has sort of ended up being a discussions about the freedom of expression in Norway, but I think we need also to think about the international situation that this report reflects and documents, and that we also have a role in trying to counter that situation. And just my final remark on this is, because I think there is a connection between the discussion we just had and our possibility to work internationally, because if we don't have, if we don't still come out at the top of the lists of the countries with freedom of expression because more theaters are prosecuted or whatever, then we lose our moral capital to criticize others. I know the Turkish embassy will follow this debate, so when our minister says you don't have freedom of expression, she will say, well, you prosecuted theater people. So it is incredibly important that we have this debate going in Norway, but that we also have the perspective of the Freemuse report that this has sort of worse consequences outside, and that we need to have an approach to the international part as well. Thank you.
Very shortly, Helge.
Yes, only once again commending Freemuse for this report. It's a huge and timely reminder about the shrinking space for freedom of expression, and that we all have to unite and fight against it. And just one small moment also within that picture is, I think, the right to human mobility is also extremely important. And it's mentioned in the report as well. It's extremely important when we are trying to find the best solutions to all these challenges. And then also a reminder with regard in the context of what's happened now also in Norway. I mean, we're working globally, but what's happening also in Norway. We have now 4 cities of refuge in Poland. The first one was Krakow. The first ICORN resident in Krakow was Maria Amalie, a refugee in Norway that was expelled by the Norwegian authorities. There's a lot of aspects to that story that we can't discuss now, but it's a reminder that we are working from Norway, many of us, but we are in a world, and we definitely have to look at what happens here and to be responsible and decent actors.
And yeah, very quickly, Katya.
I think I wanted to make a comment with regards to the right for human mobility and the right for artistic mobility. And regretfully, last year, one of the funds that OCA had to be able to support the mobility of artists from what is called O3 nations was slashed. And that means we're no longer in a position to be able to continue to bring over those artists who may be working in very difficult circumstances or with limited resources to come to Norway, to forge networks and connections, but also to bring plural perspectives. So that double role is something that we no longer are able to do. Now, we understand that this has been a decision in order to be able to favor and prioritize other aspects of mobility, since the money has been invested in places like continents like Africa or the Middle East for cross-continental mobility. But we are missing, and I think this is the point, we are missing the possibility to create bridges, as we had been for years and years, and bring those perspectives into our society.
One last question, very briefly, okay?
Thank you. My name is Tove Bratten. I'm from the Performing Arts Hub Norway, and I really want to use this occasion to apologize because we are one of the art organizations that reacted too late. But now I really want to say that this was a really wake-up call for us. And we really want to work together with the other arts organizations to fight against these processes in Norway. And I hope that we can start the work very soon. So just thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to do my apologize in this room.
So we see some solutions getting in shape already. That is great. Thank you to the panelists for coming. We will have some short kind of closing remarks by Sirak. So I welcome you up. You can just sit.
That's okay. I can speak from here just a few minutes. Thank you very much for a very inspiring exchange, and hope this will be a good start for many action to come. When we present a report like this, we always call for action. That this would not be a report to just have a look at it and interesting, and then put it aside. We call for action partly because we believe in action of global citizens to make changes around the world. When South Africa at one point has apartheid in the country, the government then have to come up with basic infrastructure to separate the white and the black, and that comes through laws and measures and institutions, and that going to schools for black and white. So these are the instruments that states created to serve the particular purposes. If we're going to secure freedom of artistic expression, we have to be able to expose some of these mechanisms that maintain and sustain that challenge that we are facing. And what we mention here, you will notice in this report, we intentionally name the laws. We say which article of which law passing by when, so that we plant the seeds for local NGOs to discuss. Last year, Freemuse spent 1.5 days. Basically, we stopped all the staff from working and sit together for 1.5 days to look at how we can campaign to change one article in the Egyptian penal code. And see the complexity of the religious body that passed the law and so on. We came up, unfortunately, at that particular time, that was too tough a target to choose in terms of campaigning and making change. But these sort of things are what we have to really look at. If you're going to make positive changes, so that we don't come here and present another report and bad news and so on, we have to pick our target one at a time. And this is where it's so important to address structural change. Everywhere we go, we also notice people will say, but we are not legal experts. We are not human rights people. We are artists. We are art community. That's absolutely fine. We all have a role. We all do our parts. There will always be opportunity for us to join hands. You don't have to be a legal expert to address this. And that we see that partly is our role to change of this analysis and turn it into campaign and action to address. Let me share you one story. I spoke just a few months ago at the Rotterdam Film Festival. They invited me to speak and say how many filmmakers are endangered. And I make a similar call. And the panel at the time was like, very interesting idea, but maybe we're not going to do that anytime soon. We'll look at trying to make 2,000 films coming and play in 1 week or so. It's being postponed. But we also make it known that if Rotterdam Film Festival is not interested, we're going to go to Berlin, we're going to go to London. We're going to find groups that care enough to actually put together a solid program to support filmmakers at risk. Not only because one Ukrainian film director was sentenced for 15 years in Russia, and he's forgotten. And he's a filmmaker. While we all enjoy films at the particular time, there's one filmmaker being isolated in a cell. And that's something we have to do. We have to really pull this together. So that's a very basic foundations of when you make structural change. There won't be any as a magic road trip. And we often say when Mandela challenged apartheid in South Africa, there was no 5-year strategic plan instead of 3 objectives each and so on. You just do what you can in front of you and connect with the people next to you. And that's how we also change. So it would be a call basically for all of us to really work in solidarity to take action when we can, whether it's a campaign for release of artists imprisoned or artists at risk, the thing that you have done already, or a call for campaign to take action to take some of the structural changes that needs to go hand in hand. And with all that, I really appreciate you being here. Look forward to working collaboratively with many of you, and look forward to making some positive change in the future also. Thank you very much.